The dress had taken Maren 3 weeks to finish. Elsie knew this because she had watched her older sister work on it by candlelight every night after supper, her fingers moving with quiet dedication through the pale green fabric, threading tiny seed pearls along the collar and hem. Maren never complained. She never asked for thanks. She simply worked, and when the dress was finally done, she had folded it carefully and placed it in Elsie's arms without ceremony. "You deserve something beautiful for once," Maren had said, and that was all. Elsie wore it now, walking through the great iron gates of Aldenveer Keep, and she tried to feel worthy of it. The gathering of clans happened once every 7 years. Lords of every major pack within the kingdom of Verethorn were expected to attend, bringing their families, their banners, and their intentions. The keep itself had been built for exactly this kind of occasion. Its great hall wide enough to swallow 3 villages whole, its stone walls hung with banners in deep crimson and charcoal gray, its iron chandeliers dripping with enough candles to light the whole of the outer courtyard. The air smelled of pine resin, roasted meat, and the dry, sharp scent of burning herbs, something the servants scattered in the hearths to welcome wolfkind, they said. To put everyone at ease. Nothing about this night put Elsie at ease. She was the second daughter of Lord Fenwick of the Ashgrove Pack, a minor house, modest lands, modest reputation. Not poor exactly, but never spoken of with admiration. Her father was a beta who had elevated himself through a fortunate marriage and a careful tongue, and he had spent 20 years reminding his daughters that their value to the family depended on whom they could attract. He had spent the last 7 years reminding Elsie specifically that she had not attracted anyone of consequence. Until Rowan. Rowan Viale was the eldest son of Lord Viale of Thornwick, an alpha house with real standing in the Western Territories. He was handsome in the obvious way, broad-shouldered and golden-haired, quick to smile and quicker to disappear. He and Elsie had known each other since childhood, bound by the proximity of their family's lands and a shared habit of slipping away from formal gatherings to walk the forest edge instead. 3 months ago, he had taken both her hands in his and told her that he intended to claim her at the gathering, that he had already decided, that she was the one he wanted, not because his father approved. His father did not approve, but because he did, and he was prepared to say so publicly. Elsie had believed him. She had spent 3 months believing him, and Maren had spent 3 weeks making a dress for the occasion, and now Elsie stood in the great hall of Aldenveer Keep, with seed pearls against her collarbone and cold stone beneath her feet, looking for Rowan's face in the crowd. She found him near the high table. He was not alone. The woman beside him was everything Elsie understood she was not. Tall, dark-haired, beautifully dressed in deep red, with the kind of composed expression that came from a lifetime of being looked at with approval. She was Lady Seraphine of the Dunholt Pack, a family of old alpha blood and considerable lands. Elsie recognized her immediately. Everyone in the hall recognized her. She was exactly the kind of woman Lord Viale would have chosen for his son. Rowan did not look ashamed. That was the part that broke something quiet and deep in Elsie's chest. Not the sight of Seraphine, not even the proprietary way the woman stood beside him, but the simple absence of shame on Rowan's face. He looked instead, relieved, as though something heavy had been set down. He saw Elsie across the hall. For a moment, one brief, terrible moment, his expression flickered. Something almost like apology crossed his face. Then someone spoke to him, and he turned away, and the moment was gone. Elsie stood completely still. Around her, the hall moved and breathed and laughed. Servants threaded between guests with trays of wine and honey bread. Dogs circled beneath the long tables, hoping for scraps. Children chased each other between adult legs, until someone caught them by the collar and pulled them back to standing. A group of Gamma warriors near the fire were arguing cheerfully about something involving horses. No one was watching Elsie. That was both the mercy and the indignity of it. She was invisible enough that no one had seen her looking, and invisible enough that no one would remark on what had just happened. Rowan had not made a scene. He had simply made a choice, weeks or months ago, probably, and simply had not told her. The dress and the pearls and the 3 weeks of Marin's careful work would go unremarked. She would not cry here. She was absolutely certain of that. She would not cry in this hall, would not make a small broken sound, would not let her face do the thing it wanted to do. She was 23 years old, and she had survived worse than this, and she would walk out of this hall with the same posture she had walked in with, and she would do it now, before her composure failed her entirely. She turned toward the side corridor that led to the eastern courtyard. She had taken perhaps 4 steps when she heard the hall change. It was subtle at first, a shift in the quality of sound, the way voices lowered and rearranged themselves, the way movement seemed to redirect like water flowing around a new obstacle. Then the great doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the change became immediate and unmistakable. 3 men entered. Elsie stopped walking, not from choice exactly, but because something in the air seemed to thicken around her and make movement feel impractical. The men who had entered were wolves. She understood that without thinking, the same way you understood thunder before you understood rain. They carried themselves in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with fact. The first, slightly ahead of the others, was lean and dark-eyed, with a slight smile that suggested he found the hall's reaction to his arrival personally amusing. The second was broader, warm-toned, with an easy expression that didn't quite reach his eyes, charming in a way that felt practiced and deliberate. The third walked a half-step behind both of them, and he was the one Elsie couldn't stop looking at. He was not the tallest, though he was tall. He was not the most ornate. His clothing was dark and plain compared to the embroidered finery around him. He had dark hair, cut close at the sides, and the kind of face that gave nothing away without apparent effort. He moved as though the hall were empty, as though the 100 people stepping back to make room for him were simply weather. His eyes swept the room once, not searching exactly, more like cataloging, and for one suspended moment, they landed on Elsie. She would have said the look lasted less than 2 seconds. It felt much longer than that. Around her, she heard voices beginning again, the specific kind of murmuring that accompanied recognition. Someone near the fire said a name, low, not quite loud enough to catch, and the man beside them gripped their arm and said it more quietly still, but the shape of it reached her anyway, syllable by syllable, the way important things often did. The Alpha King. Elsie exhaled slowly. She had known Cassian of Verathorn was expected at the gathering. Everyone had known. He ruled the entire kingdom. Every pack within Varathorn owed fealty to him, however reluctantly, and the gathering of clans was precisely the kind of event his presence formalized. She had not expected him to look like that. She had not expected him to look at her. She turned again toward the corridor. Leaving already? The voice came from her left, the lean, dark-eyed one, who had apparently separated from his companions at some point in the last 30 seconds, and was now standing close enough that she could smell pine and cool stone on him. He was watching her with that slight, amused smile, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he had asked the question not to receive an answer, but to see what she would do. "I needed air," Elsie said. "The courtyard is cold," he said. "I'm aware." He studied her for a moment longer, then glanced back toward the main floor of the hall, then back to her. "You were watching someone," he said. It was not quite a question. "You were watching me watch someone," she said, which was perhaps more forthright than the situation called for, but her composure was already under considerable strain. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but the recalibration that comes from an unexpected response. Then the smile returned, slightly different this time. "Edric," he said. and offered nothing else by way of explanation. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across them both, and the quality of the air changed again. The same dense, grounded weight she had felt when the doors opened. She looked up. Cassian, Alpha King of Verathorn, stood 2 feet away from her. He said nothing. He simply looked at her with dark, unreadable eyes, and the silence he carried was so complete that even Edric seemed to find something interesting to study on the far wall. Elsie held his gaze, because dropping it felt like losing something she couldn't name. Finally, he spoke. "You're not running," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need to be louder to be heard. "I was walking," she corrected. A pause. The briefest thing, barely a pause at all. And then, so quiet she almost missed it. "Don't." Elsie did not move. She was not entirely sure why. The word had been simple, a single syllable, more observation than command. And yet something in the way he said it made her feet find the floor differently, as though the stone beneath her had become more solid than it was a moment before. Cassian did not press. He did not step closer or explain himself. He simply held her gaze with the same steady, unhurried attention, as though he had made a suggestion and was perfectly content to wait while she decided what to do with it. Around them, the hall continued its noise and movement, but a small, strange pocket of stillness had formed in this corner, and Elsie was acutely aware that several people were watching it from a careful distance. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "Then you have no particular reason to care where I go." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said very simply, "I have a reason." Edric, somewhere to her left, made a quiet sound that was not quite a cough. Elsie glanced toward him. He was studying the banner above the nearest archway with an expression of tremendous concentration, as though the embroidered wolf upon it had revealed something philosophically challenging. The broader, warm-toned man, whom she had not yet heard speak, had joined them at some point and stood slightly apart, his easy expression still in place, though his eyes moved between Cassian and Elsie with something sharper than casual interest beneath it. "Kale," Cassian said, without looking at him. "My lord," the broader man replied. "Find out who she came with." Elsie stiffened. "You can ask me directly." Cassian looked at her again. Something shifted. Not quite amusement. Too restrained for that, but something adjacent to it. "Who did you come with?" "My father, Lord Fenwick of Ashgrove." She paused. "We are not a family of consequence. You won't have heard of us." "I've heard of Ashgrove," he said. That surprised her. She did not let it show, or tried not to. "Then you know there's no political reason to concern yourself with where I stand in this hall." "Politics isn't the reason," he said. The simplicity of it disarmed her more than any elaborate speech could have. Elsie had grown up watching her father navigate language the way a man navigates a field of hidden traps, carefully, with constant attention to what each word might cost. Cassian spoke as though words cost nothing, because he never needed to spend them strategically. He simply said what was true and allowed others to arrange themselves around it. Before she could formulate a response that was neither foolish nor rude, a new presence broke through the edge of their small circle. Her father. Lord Fenwick of Ashgrove was a compact man with graying hair and the look of someone who had spent decades making rapid calculations. He arrived at Elsie's side with the particular speed of a man who had spotted something significant from across a room and crossed it in the least conspicuous way possible. His eyes moved to Cassian, then to Edric, then to Kale, then back to Cassian. And in the space of that single glance, he had clearly assessed the situation and arrived at conclusions that were making his hands shake slightly at his sides. He bowed, deeply, the way you bowed to a king. "My Lord Cassian," he said, "an honor beyond measure. I am Lord Fenwick, and this is my daughter, Elsie." Cassian said. Her father blinked. You, yes, Elsie, my second daughter. I also have an elder daughter, Marin, who is... I know who I'm speaking to, Cassian said, with a patience that was somehow more final than impatience would have been. Fenwick closed his mouth. Elsie looked at her father and felt the familiar, complicated mixture of things she always felt when she looked at him. A worn-down affection, old disappointments, the dull ache of being perpetually assessed rather than seen. He was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had always looked through her toward whatever utility she might represent, and she had stopped expecting anything different. Walk with me, Cassian said to her. It was not precisely a question. It was also not quite a command. There was a space in it, she realized, a real one. He was waiting. All right, she said. Her father said nothing. When she glanced back at him, he was watching with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Stunned, recalculating, unable to land on a response to something this far outside his models for how the world worked. Elsie turned away and walked beside the Alpha King of Verathorn. The crowd parted, not dramatically, not with any performance, but simply and immediately, the way water parts around a stone. She was aware of eyes on her. She was aware of the sudden, sharp attention of people who had not registered her existence earlier in the evening and were now registering it very thoroughly. She kept her own gaze forward and her posture straight and tried to remember that she had made a decision to leave this hall with her dignity intact, and walking beside Cassian was, technically, still a form of leaving. They moved along the outer edge of the great hall, past long tables and iron braziers, past clusters of nobles who went very quiet as they passed. Edric and Cale followed at a discreet distance, close enough to be present, far enough to allow the illusion of privacy. You were going to walk out through the eastern corridor, Cassian said. Yes. Why? She considered lying. It would have been easy. She could have said she needed air, as she had told Edric, and it was even partially true. But something about his directness made deflection feel small. Someone made a promise, she said. He chose not to keep it tonight. Staying felt pointless. A pause. They had reached a section of the hall where the wall opened into a shallow alcove, a stone bench beneath a narrow window that looked out onto the inner courtyard. Cassian stopped there. Rowan Vale, he said. Elsie looked at him sharply. You know him. I know his family. His father sent letters requesting a favorable trade arrangement 2 months ago. He looked out the window. He also sent a separate letter expressing concern that his son intended to form an attachment the family considered unsuitable. The information landed with a strange, flat weight. So it had been decided 2 months ago, at least, and Rowan had still taken her hands, still said what he said, still allowed her to spend 3 months expecting something he had already known he would not deliver. He told you he was ending it with me, she said, though ending implied something more formal than what they had been. He told my court secretary, who summarized it in a briefing I read. It was not a significant document. Cassian looked at her then, directly. It wasn't you he was describing as unsuitable. It was himself, his own courage. The letter made that clear, if you read it honestly. Elsie had not expected that. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window at the courtyard, where torches burned in iron brackets, and 2 guards moved in slow rotation at the gate. The night air coming through the narrow gap in the stone was cold and smelled of damp earth and smoke. You read a briefing about me, she said. About Ashgrove territory and its alliances, he said. You appeared in 1 line. 1 line, she repeated. Your name and your age, he said. That's all it said. She was quiet. I noticed it, he added after a moment. He said it the way he said most things, with no particular weight placed on it, no expectation that she would respond with gratitude or surprise. Simply a fact. He had noticed one line in a briefing document, and tonight she was standing beside him in the great hall of Aldenvere Keep, and she did not know what to do with the chain of causality connecting those two things. "Why?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. She was beginning to understand that his silences were not evasions. They were the space in which he decided whether a thing was worth saying, and how precisely to say it. When he spoke, it was always with the sense that the answer had been measured first. "There is a scent," he said. "Some wolves carry it. Old blood, not ancient houses or inherited titles, but something that runs deeper than those. A bloodline that predates the current divisions between packs." He paused. "I could smell it when I entered the hall. I followed it." Elsie turned to look at him fully. He met her eyes. "It led here." For a long moment, she said nothing at all. The seed pearls on her collar caught the torchlight and threw faint sparks against the stone wall. Somewhere behind them, the hall's noise rose and fell like breathing. "I don't know what that means," she said at last. "Neither do I entirely," he said, which was not the answer she had expected from a king. "But I know I don't want you walking out through the eastern corridor." Edric appeared at the alcove's edge, carefully not looking at either of them. "My lord, Lord Vial is asking to present his son formally at the high table." Cassian did not move. "Tell him the high table will receive them in the second hour. And if he presses, he won't." A pause. "Tell him I'm occupied." Edric withdrew. Cale, still a polite distance away, caught Elsie's eye with the briefest lift of his brow. Not mocking, more acknowledging, as if to say, "Yes, this is unusual." "No, I don't know where it leads either." Elsie turned back to the window. Outside, one of the guards had paused his rotation and was looking up at the sky, where the moon had risen full and pale above the keep's outer wall. Its light fell clean and cold across the courtyard stones. "I came here expecting one thing," she said quietly. "I have no idea what to expect now." "Good," Cassian said. And for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might begin. "Neither do I." The second hour of the gathering brought formalities. Elsie watched from a seat that had not existed for her at the beginning of the evening. A chair at the far end of the high table, placed there quietly by a servant, who had appeared at Cassian's word and disappeared just as efficiently. It was not the seat of honor. It was not positioned beside the king. But it was at the high table, which was a place Elsie had never expected to occupy in any hall, least of all this one. And the fact of it sat strangely on her, like a garment cut for someone slightly different. Marin found her before the presentations began. She came through the crowd with the particular determined efficiency of a woman who had been searching for some time and was relieved to have found what she was looking for. She was 3 years older than Elsie, broader in the shoulder, with warm brown hair and eyes that noticed things. She had always noticed things, which was both her greatest quality and the reason she occasionally knew more about a situation than was comfortable. She stopped at the edge of the high table area, took in the chair, the table, and the general geography of where her sister was sitting, and her expression moved through several distinct phases, before arriving at something carefully neutral. She sat in an empty chair beside Elsie that had not been designated for anyone. "Father is beside himself," she said quietly. "I imagine. He keeps stopping people to mention that the king spoke with you at length." "It was not that long." Marin looked at her. "Elsie, you're sitting at the high table." "I'm aware." "How did—" Marin stopped, restarted. "Who put you here?" Elsie glanced toward the far end of the table, where Cassian sat in the central seat with the settled authority of a man who occupied whatever space he was in completely. He was speaking with an older lord whose banner she didn't recognize, his expression attentive and unrevealing. He had not looked toward her since they had walked from the alcove. Marin followed her glance. The careful neutrality on her face shifted into something wider. "The Alpha King," she said. "He asked me to stay." Marin pressed her lips together. Then, with the composure of someone who had spent years being the steady one, "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question that it almost undid Elsie entirely. She had been braced for astonishment, for the same rapid calculation she'd seen in her father's face, for questions about political implications and family advantage. She had not been braced for "Are you all right?" And the fact that Marin led with it made her throat tighten in a way she had been carefully managing all evening. "I saw Rowan," Elsie said. "I know. I saw him too." Marin's voice was even. "He's with Seraphine Dunholt. They appear to have been with each other for some time." "Yes. I'm sorry." "Don't be." Elsie straightened in her chair. "He made a choice. It was probably the honest one for him. I just wish he'd made it before." She stopped. Before the dress. Before 3 months of believing something. Before tonight. It doesn't matter now. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then, "The dress looks beautiful on you." Elsie laughed, very quietly, and it surprised her. A small, genuine sound that released something she hadn't realized was coiled tight in her chest. "You spent 3 weeks on it." "I'd spend 3 more. Marin looked at her steadily. "Whatever happens tonight, you came in beautifully. Remember that." Before Elsie could respond, the formal presentations began. The herald's voice rose above the hall's murmur, calling pack names and titles in the ceremonial order, and the gathered lords and their families arranged themselves for the ritual acknowledgement of the king's presence. It was old custom, older than most of the houses represented, Elsie had been told as a child, part of the framework of law and hierarchy that held the kingdom of Verathorn together across 7-year cycles of tension and alliance. Lord Viel came forward with his family in the third group, called. Rowan walked a step behind his father, Seraphine beside him with her hand resting at his arm. He had dressed formally for the occasion, his house colors sharp against the candlelight, and he carried himself with the ease of a man who had resolved a difficult question and was now simply living in the aftermath of that resolution. He did not look toward the high table until the moment his father completed the bow, and then his eyes moved, reflexively it seemed, and found Elsie exactly where she was. The look on his face lasted only a moment. Surprise first, genuine and unguarded. Then something more complicated. A rapid reassessment of what he was seeing. Elsie at the high table. Elsie in the seat that someone had placed there deliberately. Elsie in her green dress with her spine straight and her expression composed. And beside her the quiet presence of Marin. And beyond Marin, the undeniable geography of where in this hall Elsie was now sitting. He looked away. Seraphine was saying something to him. He nodded, and they moved on. Elsie kept her gaze forward. She had imagined, in the hour before the gathering, that the worst moment of the evening would be seeing Rowan's face when he acknowledged what he had done. She had imagined hurt, or satisfaction, or the particular cold clarity that sometimes followed grief. She had not imagined feeling almost nothing. Not emptiness, but a kind of settled recognition, as though what she had thought she wanted had simply turned out to be something smaller than she'd believed. And the space it left was not loss, but room. She didn't examine that feeling closely. There was too much else pressing on the evening. Edric appeared near her chair during a break in the presentations, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who operated in formal settings the way fish operated in water, naturally, without effort. "He'd like you to meet someone," he said, inclining his head slightly. "After the presentation's close, the elder lord currently at the king's right, that's Aldrich of Stonemantle. He asked who you were." Elsie looked at him. Why? Edric's slight smile returned. Because you're sitting at this table, and he doesn't know your name, and Aldrich of Stonemantle has not encountered something he doesn't know in approximately 40 years, and finds it unsettling. A pause. He also has a very particular sensitivity to bloodlines, old ones. Something cold and interested moved through Elsie. She thought of what Cassian had said in the alcove. The scent, the old blood, the thing that predated pack divisions and inherited titles. She had grown up knowing nothing extraordinary about her family. Ashgrove was a modest holding with modest history. Her mother had died when she was small, and her father had never spoken at length about her mother's people. Only that they had come from far to the north, from the mountain territories beyond the kingdom's formal borders. She had never thought to ask what that meant, in a world where bloodlines carried power. "All right," she said. Maren caught her arm briefly as she rose. "Careful," she said, very quietly. Not a warning against anything specific, just the word itself, offered from someone who had been watching out for her for 23 years. Elsie pressed her hand briefly over her sister's, and then followed Edric. Aldrich of Stonemantle was a man who had aged the way mountains aged, slowly, and without appearing to diminish. He had white hair, a deeply lined face, and eyes the pale gray of winter ice that moved when she approached with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like confirmation. He said nothing as she was introduced. He simply looked. Cassian, beside him, was watching the exchange with that same measured stillness. "Your mother," Aldrich said at last, without preamble. "Her name?" Elsie blinked. "Sarah. Sarah of the Fen family, from the Northern Territories." Something moved in Aldrich's expression, swift and significant. "Not Fen," he said. "Fen was the name she used when she came south." He looked at Cassian briefly, then back to Elsie. Her true family name was Varen. The word meant nothing to Elsie. It clearly meant something to Edric, who had gone very still, and to Cale, who had appeared at some point near the table's edge and was now watching with an expression that had shed all of its easy warmth in favor of something far more alert. "The Varen line," Aldrich continued, with the deliberateness of a man who understood the weight of what he was saying, "was the founding bloodline of this kingdom. Before the current crown, before the division into packs and territories and 7-year gatherings." He studied her face. "It was believed extinct." Elsie stood very still. "It is not extinct," Aldrich said. "It is standing in front of me in a green dress with seed pearls at the collar, and it has apparently spent 23 years in Ashgrove believing itself to be nobody in particular." She wanted to say something measured and coherent. What came out instead was, "My father doesn't know." "Your father could not have known," Aldrich said. "Your mother would not have told him. The Varen did not announce themselves. They understood that their bloodline carried a specific danger. In a kingdom built on hierarchy and pack power, an original founding line is not a gift. It is a target." He paused. "Until the right moment." Elsie looked at Cassian. He was watching her with those dark, still eyes, and she understood now, or began to, why he had followed the scent across a hall full of lords and princes and powerful men, and why it had led to one line in a briefing document, and why he had said, "I noticed it," as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He had recognized what she carried, before she knew she carried it. "What does this mean?" she said. "It means," Cassian said quietly, "that tonight changes more than you came here expecting." The night did not end with the presentations. After Aldrich spoke, Cassian had guided her, not by touch, but by presence, that quiet, gravitational pull, away from the high table, and through a side door that opened into a long corridor lit by iron sconces. The stone walls here were older than those of the main hall, rougher, without the smooth finish of renovation. Tapestries hung at intervals, their colors faded to something gentle by time, depicting scenes Elsie recognized from old stories. Wolves running beneath full moons, figures standing on high ground with their arms open, packs gathering at river crossings in seasons of peace. Edric and Cale followed. Aldrich did not. He had returned to his seat at the high table, with the unhurried manner of a man who had done what he came to do, and was content to wait for the rest of the evening to arrange itself. Cassian stopped near a window that looked out over the keep's inner forest, a dark mass of pine and oak that pressed close to the walls, restless in the night wind. "Ask what you need to ask," he said. Elsie had been organizing questions since they left the hall. She had more than she could reasonably present, so she chose the one that felt most immediate. If my mother knew what she carried and chose to hide it, in a modest holding, under a different name, she had a reason. You said yourself that this bloodline is a target. She looked at him. So, why are you telling me? Because you were going to walk out through the eastern corridor, he said, and disappear back into an ordinary life, and in 2 years or 5 years or 10, someone less careful than Aldrich would have found what you carry, and you would not have had the knowledge to protect yourself. And this is protection? She said. Being told in a public hall that I come from a bloodline powerful enough to threaten a kingdom's hierarchy. You were told in a corridor, Edric offered, from his position near the wall, which is meaningfully more private. Elsie looked at him. He returned the look with perfect composure. The hall is full of people whose sensitivity to old blood is nowhere near Aldrich's, Cassian said. They did not recognize you tonight. That will not always be the case. Not now that you are moving in these circles. A pause. Not now that you've been seen here. You put me at the high table, she said. You made me visible. Yes. It seems like it may have created the problem it was meant to solve. It changed the nature of the problem, he said, with a precision that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. He never overstated, never simplified. There is a difference between being visible under my protection and being visible without it. The word protection settled into the space between them with a weight she didn't immediately know how to respond to. It was not a romantic word. It was a practical one, clearly offered as such. And yet there was something beneath it, something in the way he said it, that made it feel like more than policy. Cale shifted near the corridor's far end. There's also the matter of Vielle, he said, in the tone of a man raising something mildly inconvenient but necessary. Cassian looked at him. He approached me during the presentations, Cale continued. He had seen Elsie at the high table by then and wanted to understand his word, arrangement. He paused. He was also wondering whether his son's prior connection to her might be worth revisiting, given the new context. The air in the corridor did something Elsie could only describe as tightening. He said that, she said flatly. He implied it with considerable transparency, Cale said. She almost laughed, a short, sharp sound that had nothing of humor in it. Of course. Not 2 hours ago, Rowan had stood in the great hall beside Seraphine Dunholt with a relieved expression, and now his father was inquiring about revisiting arrangements. The arithmetic was insultingly simple. Elsie at the low table was unsuitable. Elsie at the high table in conversation with the king was worth reconsidering. She had known the world worked this way. She had grown up watching it. It still struck her somewhere old and tender. Tell Lord Vielle, Cassian said to Cale, with a quietness that was more final than volume, that the question is not his to ask. Cale nodded and said nothing further. Elsie looked at Cassian. He was watching her with that steady attention, reading whatever was moving across her face with the same unhurried care he applied to everything. She did not try to compose her expression into something neutral. She was tired of composing herself for the comfort of a room. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this, she said. I came here tonight expecting to stand beside someone who had promised to choose me. Instead, he didn't, and you did, for reasons that have more to do with what runs in my blood than anything I've actually done. And I'm supposed to, what? Feel differently about the second thing because the first one hurt? A silence. Then Cassian said, "No." She waited. "You're not supposed to feel any particular way," he said. "What happened tonight with Vial's son was its own thing, and it was wrong, and it hurt, and those facts don't become smaller because something else happened afterward." He paused. "I'm not asking you to replace one with the other. That would be its own kind of insult." Elsie looked at him for a long moment. "Then what are you asking?" "Tonight, nothing," he said. "Tonight I'm asking you to not walk out through the eastern corridor. The rest can wait until morning." It was such a measured answer that she almost pushed back on it. And then she understood that the measure was deliberate, that he was giving her room on purpose, and that the room itself was a form of respect she had not been shown often enough to recognize it immediately. "All right," she said. "Not tonight." The morning came gray and cold, with frost on the inner courtyard stones and the smell of wood smoke threading through every corridor of the keep. Elsie had been given a guest chamber, Marin too in the adjacent room, and she had slept badly and woken early and sat by the narrow window watching the frost until the sky lightened. Marin came in without knocking, the way she always had, carrying 2 cups of something hot and sitting down on the edge of the bed with the composure of someone who had also slept badly, but was not going to mention it. "Father left at first light," she said. Elsie looked at her. "He left?" "He sent a message. He said he didn't want to—" Marin paused, choosing words. "He said the situation had moved beyond his understanding, and he trusted us to manage it wisely." She handed Elsie one of the cups. "Which I believe means he was frightened and didn't know what to do. So he did what he always does." "Left," Elsie said. "Left," Marin confirmed. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "He also said, in the last line, that he was proud of you. I don't know if that's true or if he thought it was what he should say, but he wrote it." Elsie drank from her cup. It was a hot herbed broth, simple and warming. She let it sit in her hands and looked at the frost on the window's edge. "Marin, what do you know about our mother's family?" Marin was quiet for a moment. "Not much. She died when I was 6. She used to tell stories, wolves who ran in the old places before the packs divided. She said her grandmother had been born in the mountain forests, where the trees were so old they remembered the first wolves." She looked at Elsie. "I thought they were children's stories." They weren't. Marin absorbed this. She was quiet in the way she was always quiet when she was thinking, fully, without performing it. Then, what happens now? Before Elsie could answer, there was a knock at the chamber door. Cale's voice came through the wood. "My Lord Cassian requests your presence in the Eastern Hall when you are ready. There is no urgency. He said to tell you that clearly." Marin raised her eyebrows at Elsie. Elsie set down her cup. "Tell him we'll come shortly," she called toward the door. "Both of you are welcome," Cale said. He was specific about that. Marin looked at her sister with an expression that had moved past astonishment into something quieter and more lasting. "He included me," she said. "He seems to pay attention to details," Elsie said, and stood to find her cloak. The Eastern Hall was smaller than the Great Hall, lit by morning light through high-arched windows rather than candlelight. A long table held bread, soft cheese, preserved fruit, and a ceramic pot of something steaming. Aldrich was already seated. Edric was standing near the window, eating an apple with the relaxed air of a man for whom all situations were equally manageable. Cassian stood when they entered. Not as ceremony, simply standing. The way you stood when someone came into a room and you wished to acknowledge them. He looked at Elsie. then at Maren, to whom he gave a small, deliberate nod. Maren, to her credit, managed a composed curtsy before sitting down. Elsie took the chair across from Cassian. He sat again. Between them, the morning light fell across the table in long pale strips, and outside the arched windows the frost was beginning to melt from the courtyard stones, and the pines at the forest's edge were dark and very still. "Aldrich would like to tell you more," Cassian said, "if you're willing to hear it." Elsie looked at the old man, who was watching her with those winter-pale eyes and the patience of someone who had waited a long time for a particular morning to arrive. "Tell me," she said. Aldrich spoke for a long time. He spoke of the Varen line the way men spoke of rivers, tracing it back to its source with the confidence of someone who had studied the path for decades. The founding wolves of Varathorn had not been a single pack, but a convergence of 3, and the Varen had stood at the center of that convergence, not as conquerors, but as the bloodline that other lines had recognized instinctively, the way wolves recognized a true north. They had not ruled through force. They had ruled through something older than force, something that lived in the bone and the breath and the particular quality of presence that made other wolves still without knowing why. When the kingdom had fractured into competing packs 3 generations ago, the Vaeren had not fought for dominance. They had simply gone quiet, scattered. Let the world believe what it needed to believe about them, which was nothing. Elsie's mother had been the last known Varen to carry the full line undiluted. She had gone north, then south, then farther south still, into Ashgrove, where no one asked careful questions about bloodlines and a woman with a different name and a quiet manner could build a small, ordinary life. She had succeeded. Entirely. Until now. "She gave you her blood," Aldrich said, "and she gave you her silence, and both were deliberate. She could not have known whether the silence would hold past her death." He folded his hands on the table. It held long enough. Elsie sat with all of this for a moment. Maren, beside her, had not spoken once during Aldrich's account, but her hand had found Elsie's beneath the table at some point and had not let go. "If I am what you say I am," Elsie said carefully, "then my presence in any public setting is a disruption to the current order. Pack lords who built their power on the assumption that this bloodline was gone will not be comfortable with its reappearance." She looked at Cassian. "Which means last night may have already created consequences." "It has," Cassian said. 2 lords sent request for private audience with me before dawn. Neither gave a stated reason. But you know the reason. I know the reason. Edric, near the window, had finished his apple and was now simply watching the room with the attention of a man cataloging something. Cale sat with his forearms on the table, steady and quiet. "What do you intend to do?" Elsie asked. Cassian was still for a moment. Then he said, "That depends in part on you." She waited. "The Varen line changes the political landscape of this kingdom," he said. "Not because I choose to use it as a tool, I won't, but because its existence will become known now, and other people will choose to use it whether or not you consent to that. The question is whether you face that standing alone or standing within a structure that can absorb the pressure." "You mean your court," she said. "I mean something more specific than that." He met her eyes. "I mean as my mate." The room was very quiet. Maren's hand tightened slightly around hers. Elsie looked at Cassian and found him looking back at her with the same measured steadiness he brought to everything. No performance, no urgency, no attempt to fill the silence with reassurance that would only serve his own comfort. He had said it the same way he said everything, directly, with space left around it for her to move in. "You said last night that you weren't asking anything of me," she said. "Last night, I wasn't," he said. "This morning, the situation has developed. I told you I would give you time, And I am telling you now that the time is shorter than I'd prefer, because 2 lords are waiting for audiences and more will follow, and the position you stand in depends on what answer I give them." He paused. "But I want to be clear about what I'm asking and why. I'm not asking because of the bloodline. The bloodline is a reason the world will give you for why this matters. It is not my reason." "Then what is your reason?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. That considered silence. "You corrected me," he said. "Last night, when I said you were running. You said you were walking, and you were right, and the distinction mattered to you even in a moment when most people would not have had the composure to make it." He paused. "You held Rowan Vale's failure without breaking in front of a hall full of people who were not worth breaking in front of. You asked me direct questions when a more cautious woman would have been careful with a king." A pause. "I have spent years in rooms full of people performing the version of themselves they thought I wanted to see. You didn't." Elsie looked at him for a long moment. Something had shifted in her chest. Not the warm, immediate feeling of the stories she had grown up hearing, but something quieter and more durable. Something that felt like the beginning of being genuinely seen. "If I say yes," she said, "it isn't because I have no other choice." "I know," he said. "And if things between us don't come easily, if there are disagreements, if I am not what you imagined, then we will navigate that," he said, "as people do." She looked at Maren. Maren looked back at her with clear, steady eyes. She did not nod or shake her head. She simply held Elsie's gaze and let her sister make the decision that belonged to her. Elsie turned back to Cassian. "Yes," she said. What followed was not immediate or simple, and Elsie had not expected it to be. The 2 lords who had requested private audience with Cassian received their audiences that same morning. She did not attend. Cassian had not asked her to, and she did not need to. What reached her afterward, through Cale's careful accounting, was that both lords had raised the question of the Varen line's legitimacy, one with the language of concern, and one with language considerably less civil. Cassian had received both with the same expression and given both the same answer. The matter was settled and not subject to further discussion. Neither lord pushed further. Rowan Val and his family departed Aldenvere Keep before midday. She learned this not from anyone who told her directly, but from Maren, who had seen the Thornwick banners being taken down from the outer courtyard and had simply reported the fact without editorial. Elsie received it the same way. Rowan had made his choices and would live with them, and she found, standing in the morning light of the eastern hall with warm broth in her hands, and the sound of Edric arguing companionably with Cale about something involving horses in the corridor, that she did not need him to understand what he had lost. Some things resolved themselves without witnesses. Aldrich spent the remainder of the day with Elsie and Maren, telling them what he knew of the Varen history in more detail. The stories, the traditions, the specific qualities the bloodline had carried, and what they might mean in practice. He was meticulous and patient, and occasionally dry in a way that made Maren laugh, which Elsie noted with a quiet warmth. By the time the evening meal came, Maren had begun asking Aldrich questions of her own, and the old lord answered them with the look of a man who found genuine satisfaction in being asked. Edric, at some point during the evening meal, leaned over to Elsie and said in a low voice, "For what it is worth, I have traveled with him for 11 years, and I have never seen him tell someone not to leave before." He reached for his wine cup. "I thought you should know that." Elsie looked at him. "Is that meant to be reassuring?" "It's meant to be accurate," he said. "Reassurance is not really my area." Cale, from across the table, "It really isn't." 3 months later, in the great hall of Varathorn's central keep, a hall that made Aldenvere's look modest, Elsie stood in a different dress. This one she had not made herself, and Maren had not made it either, though Maren had sat with the seamstress through every fitting and had opinions about the embroidery that the seamstress had accepted with the grace of someone who recognized when they were being helped. The dress was the deep blue-gray of winter sky, and it had no seed pearls. It had instead small dark stones at the cuffs and collar that caught the torchlight and held it, and when Cassian saw her walk into the hall, he went still, in the particular way she had come to recognize as his version of being moved. The ceremony was old, older than the current court, older than the pack divisions, which was appropriate, Aldrich had noted with satisfaction, given the bloodline involved. It involved words spoken before the assembled lords of Varathorn, the formal acknowledgement of a bond, and the presentation of the united pair to the gathered court. Cassian spoke his part of the words quietly, as he did everything, without performance. But he held her eyes throughout, and she understood that the words, however old and formal, were being given their full weight. She spoke her own with a steady voice. Marin stood nearby, composed and clear-eyed and present. Edric stood on Cassian's other side and managed, for once, to look entirely sincere. Cale simply looked relieved, in the way of a man who had hoped for a particular outcome and was grateful to see it arrive. Aldrich, in his seat at the front of the assembled court, watched the proceedings with the expression of a man settling a debt he had carried for a very long time. In the months that followed, the court of Varathorn adjusted itself, as courts do, not smoothly or without friction, but with the gradual accommodation of something real. Lords who had been uncertain became less so. Alliances that had been tentative became more defined. The Varan name, spoken aloud for the first time in a generation, did what old names do when they are finally given air. It took root. Elsie did not become someone different. She remained the woman who corrected imprecise statements, who asked direct questions, who held difficulty without performing her reaction to it for an audience. She learned the court's rhythms and where she could push against them, and where she needed to move with them. And she learned this the way she had learned most things, by watching carefully and then deciding. Cassian watched her navigate it with the same attention he had given her from the beginning, and periodically she would look up and find him watching, and neither of them would say anything, because nothing needed to be said. Marin remained at court, at Elsie's request and Cassian's quiet arrangement. She took a position working alongside Aldrich, helping to document the historical records the old lord had spent decades compiling, a task she was suited for in every possible way, and which gave her a purpose in this new life that was entirely her own. Aldrich, who had carried the knowledge of the Varan line alone for longer than anyone should carry anything alone, spent his remaining years putting that knowledge into order, with Marin's patient assistance. He died in his own room in the keep, in the deep of winter, with a finished record on the table beside him, and a look on his face that Marin described, quietly, as someone who had completed what they came to do. Edric continued to be exactly what he was, which the court had largely come to accept as a fixed feature of the landscape. Cale remained steady and warm-eyed and reliable, which was worth more, Elsie had come to understand, than almost any other quality a person could have. The green dress with the seed pearls hung in a chest in Elsie's chambers. She kept it not from sentiment about the night she had first worn it, but from sentiment about the 3 weeks Marin had spent making it, and what those weeks said about the kind of love that does not wait to be asked. She did not know if she would have called the path that brought her here a good one. It had contained real hurt, real loss, the particular grief of discovering that someone you had trusted had quietly decided you were not worth choosing. But it had also contained a corridor with old tapestries on the walls, and a window looking onto a dark forest, and a man who had said don't in a quiet voice, and meant it as an invitation rather than a command. And it had ended here, in a keep that was now her home, in a life that was genuinely her own, with the people she loved present, and her mother's name spoken with the dignity it had always deserved. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything.